The clock on Officer Derek Morrison's patrol car showed 9:47 p.m. as he sat parked behind a billboard on Highway 45. The road was quiet now, with only a few cars passing by every few minutes. Morrison had been a police officer for 12 years, and he knew this stretch of highway well. It was one of his favorite spots to catch speeders, especially late at night when people thought they could get away with breaking the law. Morrison was not like the other officers at his station. While his colleagues tried to be fair and respectful to everyone, Morrison had his own ideas about how policing should work. He believed some people deserved more respect than others. He had strong opinions about who belonged where and who should be driving expensive cars. These opinions had gotten him in trouble before, but he never seemed to learn from his mistakes. As Morrison sat in his car, scrolling through his phone, a black luxury sedan drove past him. The car was moving fast, maybe 10 miles over the speed limit, but it was not just the speed that caught Morrison's attention. It was the type of car and the fact that he could see a black woman driving it. In Morrison's mind, something did not add up. How could someone like that afford such an expensive vehicle? He immediately became suspicious. Morrison started his engine and pulled out onto the highway. He followed the sedan for about a mile, watching it carefully. The driver was not doing anything wrong except driving a little fast. She stayed in her lane, used her turn signals, and drove smoothly. But Morrison had already made up his mind. He was going to pull her over. The woman driving the sedan was Judge Patricia Williams. She was 52 years old and had been a federal judge for 8 years. Before that, she had worked as a lawyer for 15 years. Judge Williams was well respected in the legal community and known for being fair and intelligent. She had worked hard her entire life to get where she was. Judge Williams was driving home from the federal courthouse in downtown Memphis. She had stayed late to finish reading case files for the next day's hearings. It had been a long day and she was tired. All she wanted was to get home to her family and have a quiet evening. She had no idea that Officer Morrison was following her. When Morrison turned on his flashing lights, Judge Williams looked in her rearview mirror and sighed. She had been driving a little fast and she knew it. She carefully pulled over to the side of the road and turned on her hazard lights. She rolled down her window and placed her hands on the steering wheel where the officer could see them. Judge Williams knew how to behave during a traffic stop because she had seen many cases in her courtroom involving police encounters. Morrison parked his patrol car behind the sedan and got out slowly. He adjusted his gun belt and put on his most serious expression. As he walked toward the driver's side window, he was already forming his opinion about this stop. In his experience, people who drove cars like this and looked like this driver usually had something to hide. Judge Williams watched Morrison approach in her side mirror. She could see that he was a white officer, probably in his 40s, with a stern expression. She had dealt with all kinds of people in her years as a judge, including police officers who testified in her courtroom. She hoped this would be a simple traffic stop that would end quickly. Morrison reached the driver's window and bent down to look inside the car. He saw a well-dressed black woman wearing a business suit. Her hair was neat and she wore small gold earrings. The car's interior was clean and expensive-looking. All of this made Morrison even more suspicious. "Good evening, ma'am," Morrison said in a cold voice. "Do you know why I stopped you?" Judge Williams looked at Morrison calmly. "I believe I was driving over the speed limit, officer. I apologize for that." Morrison was surprised by her polite response and proper way of speaking. Most people he stopped made excuses or argued with him, but her politeness did not change his suspicious feelings. If anything, it made him think she was trying to trick him. "License and registration," Morrison demanded, not bothering to be polite in return. Judge Williams reached slowly for her purse, making sure Morrison could see her movements. She pulled out her wallet and removed her driver's license. Then she opened her glove compartment and took out her car registration, but she also pulled out something else, her federal judge identification card. Morrison took the documents and shined his flashlight on them. The driver's license looked normal enough. The registration matched the car. But when he saw the federal judge ID, his expression changed completely. His face twisted with disbelief and anger. "What is this supposed to be?" Morrison asked, holding up the judge ID. "That is my judicial identification, officer. I am Judge Patricia Williams, and I serve on the federal bench here in Memphis." Morrison stared at the ID card and then at Judge Williams. In his mind, there was no way this could be real. He had never seen a black federal judge before, and he did not believe such a person could exist. In his twisted thinking, important positions like federal judge were meant for other kinds of people, not people who looked like the woman sitting in front of him. "This is fake," Morrison said loudly. "There's no way you're a federal judge." Judge Williams remained calm even though she was starting to feel worried. She had encountered prejudice before in her career, but never from a police officer during a traffic stop. She knew she had to be careful. "Officer, I assure you that my identification is completely real. If you would like to verify it, you can call the federal courthouse or check with your supervisor." But Morrison was not interested in checking anything. His prejudice had taken over his thinking completely. He was convinced that this woman was trying to fool him with fake identification. In his mind, she was probably a criminal who had stolen the car and the fake ID. The situation was about to become much worse than either of them could imagine. Morrison's inability to accept that a black woman could hold such an important position was going to turn a simple traffic stop into a nightmare that would change both of their lives forever. Judge Williams sat in her car, still holding the steering wheel, and tried to stay calm. She had no idea that the next few hours would test everything she had learned about the law, justice, and human dignity. Morrison held the federal judge ID card under his flashlight and studied it closely. The card looked official with its government seal and professional photo, but his mind refused to accept what he was seeing. In his 12 years as a police officer, Morrison had developed strong beliefs about who belonged in positions of power, and those beliefs were now clouding his judgment completely. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," Morrison said, his voice becoming harder and more demanding. Judge Williams felt her heart rate increase. This was not how traffic stops were supposed to go. She had been pulled over twice before in her life, and both times had been quick and professional. This felt different and dangerous. "Officer, may I ask why you need me to step out of the car? I was only speeding slightly, and I have provided all the documentation you requested." Morrison's face grew red with anger. "Don't question me, lady. I said get out of the car, now." Judge Williams knew she had to be very careful. She had seen too many cases in her courtroom where simple encounters between police and citizens had gone wrong. She also knew that as a federal judge, she had certain protections under the law, but those protections would not help her if this situation became violent. "Officer, I am going to comply with your request, but I want to make sure you understand who I am. I am Judge Patricia Williams, and I serve on the United States District Court for the Western District of Tennessee. My chambers are located in the Clifford Davis Federal Building in downtown Memphis." Morrison laughed, but it was not a friendly laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes from someone who thinks they have caught someone in a lie. "Right, and I'm the President of the United States. Lady, this fake ID might fool some people, but it doesn't fool me." Judge Williams slowly opened her car door and stepped onto the roadside. She was wearing a navy blue business suit and low heels. Her movements were careful and deliberate because she knew that any sudden motion could make the situation worse. "Officer, what is your name and badge number?" Judge Williams asked in her most professional voice. "Officer Derek Morrison, badge number 2847, and you're in a lot of trouble for impersonating a federal official. That's a serious crime." Judge Williams tried to remain calm, but she was beginning to understand that this officer was not going to listen to reason. His mind was made up, and nothing she said was going to change it. She had encountered prejudice before, but never anything this extreme or dangerous. Morrison walked around to the back of Judge Williams's car and shined his flashlight on the license plate. Everything looked normal, but he was convinced there had to be something wrong. In his thinking, criminals were clever, and this woman was obviously a very good criminal if she had managed to get such realistic-looking fake documents. "Whose car is this, really?" Morrison demanded. "It is my car, officer. I purchased it 2 years ago, and the registration clearly shows that." Morrison came back to where Judge Williams was standing. He looked her up and down, taking in her professional appearance and confident manner. Instead of making him realize his mistake, her dignity seemed to make him angrier. "You know what I think? I think you stole this car from some rich white lady, and you made fake documents to go with it. That's identity theft, car theft, and impersonating a federal official. You're looking at serious prison time." Judge Williams took a deep breath. She had spent her entire career dealing with difficult people and challenging situations. But this was testing her patience and her fear in ways she had never experienced. "Officer Morrison, I am going to say this one more time very clearly. I'm Judge Patricia Williams. I have been a federal judge for 8 years. If you do not believe me, please call your supervisor or contact the federal courthouse. They will confirm my identity immediately." Morrison stepped closer to Judge Williams, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate her. "I don't need to call anybody. I know a fake when I see one, and I know criminals when I see them." Judge Williams could smell the coffee on Morrison's breath and see the anger in his eyes. She realized that this man was not just mistaken. He was dangerous. His prejudice had made him completely unable to see the truth that was right in front of him. "Officer, I would like to call my court security detail. They can verify my identity for you." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "You're not calling anybody. Give me your phone." Judge Williams hesitated. She knew that as a federal judge, she had the right to contact her security detail at any time, but she also knew that this situation was spiraling out of control, and she needed to be very careful about how she handled it. "Officer, I have the right to make a phone call, especially to verify my identity." Morrison moved even closer. "You have the right to shut up and do what I tell you. Give me the phone or I'll take it from you." Judge Williams slowly reached into her purse and pulled out her cell phone. Morrison snatched it from her hand so quickly that she almost dropped her purse. He looked at the phone and saw that it was an expensive model, which in his mind was more evidence that she was a criminal. "Nice phone for someone who's supposed to be a judge," Morrison said sarcastically. "I bet you stole this too." Morrison scrolled through the phone, looking at the contacts and recent calls. He saw names like Chief Judge Martin, Court Security, and Federal Marshal Thompson. These should have been clues that Judge Williams was telling the truth, but Morrison's prejudice was too strong. He convinced himself that these were fake contacts that the criminal had created to support her story. "Real clever," Morrison said. "You even made fake contacts to go with your fake ID. But you made one mistake. You picked the wrong cop to try this on." Judge Williams watched Morrison go through her phone and felt a deep sense of violation. This was not just about racial prejudice anymore. This was about a police officer who had completely lost control and was violating her rights as both a citizen and a federal official. "Officer Morrison, what you are doing right now is illegal. You are violating my constitutional rights and you are interfering with a federal judge in the performance of her duties." Morrison laughed again. "Constitutional rights? Lady, criminals don't get to lecture me about constitutional rights. You should have thought about that before you decided to steal a car and make fake federal documents." The situation was becoming more dangerous by the minute. Morrison's body camera, which should have been recording everything, had a convenient malfunction, something that seemed to happen often when Morrison was involved in controversial encounters. Judge Williams was now completely alone on a dark highway with a police officer who refused to believe who she was and seemed determined to prove she was a criminal. Judge Williams knew that. She was in serious trouble. This was no longer a simple case of mistaken identity. This was a police officer whose prejudice had made him completely unable to see reality, and she was beginning to understand that this night was far from over. Morrison walked back to his patrol car, still holding Judge Williams's phone and identification documents. He opened his trunk and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. The metal gleamed under the highway lights as he walked back toward where Judge Williams stood waiting by her car. Judge Williams saw the handcuffs and felt a chill run down her spine. In all her years as a lawyer and judge, she had never imagined she would be on this side of the law enforcement process. She had sent many people to prison, but she had always done so fairly and according to the law. Now she was about to experience what it felt like to be falsely accused and arrested. "Officer Morrison, you are making a serious mistake. I am a federal judge, and what you are about to do is a federal crime." Morrison stopped in front of her and held up the handcuffs. "The only federal crime here is you impersonating a federal official. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Judge Williams did not move. She knew that once those handcuffs were on her wrists, this situation would become even more serious. She also knew that Morrison was already committing several crimes by refusing to verify her identity and by treating her this way. "Officer, I am asking you one last time to contact your supervisor or the federal courthouse. This can all be cleared up with one phone call." Morrison's patience was completely gone. His prejudice and stubbornness had taken over all rational thinking. "I said turn around, now." Judge Williams turned around slowly, knowing she had no choice. She felt Morrison grab her wrists roughly and snap the cold metal handcuffs into place. The cuffs were tight, tighter than they needed to be. and they cut into her skin. "You have the right to remain silent," Morrison began reading the Miranda rights. But his voice was full of satisfaction, rather than the professional tone that should be used during an arrest. Judge Williams listened to the familiar words that she had heard read thousands of times in her courtroom. But hearing them directed at her felt surreal and frightening. She knew these rights by heart, probably better than Morrison did, but knowing her rights and being able to exercise them were two different things. Morrison led Judge Williams to his patrol car and opened the back door. The back seat was separated from the front by a metal and plastic barrier, and there were no door handles on the inside. Judge Williams had to duck her head to get into the small space, which was difficult with her hands cuffed behind her back. The back seat smelled like disinfectant and fear. Judge Williams could see scratches on the windows where other arrested people had tried to get out. She had never thought about what this experience felt like for the people who appeared in her courtroom, but now she was learning firsthand. Morrison got into the front seat and started filling out paperwork. He wrote down that he had arrested someone for impersonating a federal official, resisting arrest, and suspicious activity. None of these charges were true, but Morrison was now too deep into his lie to turn back. "Where are you taking me?" Judge Williams asked through the barrier. "To the station for booking. You'll get your phone call there, and you can try to explain to the detective how you got all these fake documents." Judge Williams knew that Morrison was supposed to verify her identity before making an arrest, especially when she claimed to be a federal official. But she also knew that some police officers did not always follow the rules, particularly when their prejudices were involved. As Morrison drove toward the police station, Judge Williams tried to think about her options. Her husband would be expecting her home soon, and when she did not arrive, he would start to worry. Her court security detail would also notice if she did not check in as scheduled, but she had no way to contact anyone because Morrison had taken her phone. Judge Williams also thought about the legal implications of what Morrison was doing. By arresting a federal judge without cause, he was committing several federal crimes. By refusing to verify her identity, he was violating department policy. By treating her roughly and denying her rights, he was opening himself and his department up to serious lawsuits. But Judge Williams also knew that being right about the law did not always protect you from bad police officers. She had seen too many cases where people's rights were violated, and the officers faced little or no consequences. The difference was that she was a federal judge, and federal judges had protections that regular citizens did not have. Morrison pulled into the police station parking lot and parked near the back entrance. The station was a brick building that had been built in the 1970s and looked old and tired. There were several other patrol cars in the parking lot, which meant other officers were working that night. "All right, let's go," Morrison said as he opened Judge Williams' door. Getting out of the car with handcuffs on was even harder than getting in had been. Judge Williams had to twist her body awkwardly, and Morrison did not help her at all. She almost fell, but managed to catch her balance at the last second. Morrison led Judge Williams through the back door of the police station. The hallway was painted a dull green color and had fluorescent lights that buzzed loudly. They passed several office doors and a small break room before reaching the booking area. The booking area had a long counter with a computer and fingerprinting equipment. Behind the counter sat Sergeant Maria Lopez, a 15-year veteran of the police force. Lopez looked up when Morrison brought Judge Williams in, and her expression immediately showed confusion. "Morrison, what do you have here?" Sergeant Lopez asked. "Arrested this woman for impersonating a federal official. Claims she's a judge, but her ID is obviously fake." Sergeant Lopez looked at Judge Williams more carefully. She saw a well-dressed professional woman who did not look like the usual people Morrison brought in. Something about the situation did not feel right to Lopez. "Ma'am, what is your name?" Lopez asked kindly. "I am Judge Patricia Williams, United States District Judge for the Western District of Tennessee. Officer Morrison has made a serious mistake." Lopez looked at Morrison with raised eyebrows. "Morrison, did you verify her identity?" Morrison's face grew red. "I don't need to verify anything. Look at this fake ID she had." He handed Judge Williams' judicial identification to Lopez. Lopez examined the ID carefully. Unlike Morrison, she had seen federal identification before, and this looked completely legitimate to her. The seal was correct, the format was right, and the photo clearly matched the woman standing in front of her. Morrison, this ID looks real to me. Did you call the courthouse to check? I told you I don't need to check anything. It's fake and she's going in a cell until we can sort this out. Judge Williams looked at Sergeant Lopez hopefully. Here was someone who seemed willing to listen to reason. Sergeant, if you would just make one phone call to the federal courthouse, this entire misunderstanding can be resolved immediately. But Morrison was not interested in resolving anything. He was determined to prove he was right, even though deep down he was starting to have doubts. His pride would not let him admit that he might have made a mistake, especially not in front of another officer. The situation was about to get much worse before it got better. Sergeant Lopez held Judge Williams's federal ID card under the bright booking area lights and studied it carefully. She had been a police officer for 15 years and had seen many types of identification, both real and fake. Everything about this ID looked legitimate. The government seal, the high-quality printing, the security features, and the professional photograph. Morrison, I really think you should let me make a phone call to verify this, Lopez said, looking concerned. Morrison snatched the ID back from Lopez. I'm the arresting officer here, and I'm telling you this is fake. She's going in a holding cell, and that's final. Judge Williams watched this exchange with growing alarm. She could see that Sergeant Lopez had doubts about Morrison's judgment, but she also could see that Morrison was not going to back down. His pride and prejudice had taken over completely, and he was now committed to his false story. Sergeant Lopez, Judge Williams said calmly, I understand that you have to follow procedures, but I am asking you as a fellow law enforcement professional to please verify my identity. One phone call will resolve this entire situation. Lopez looked back and forth between Morrison and Judge Williams. Her instincts told her that something was very wrong with this arrest. The woman in front of her spoke like an educated professional, carried herself with dignity, and knew exactly what legal rights she had. This was not the typical behavior of someone trying to commit fraud. Morrison, what exactly happened during this traffic stop? Lopez asked. Morrison's story came out in a rush. I stopped her for speeding on Highway 45. When I asked for her license and registration, she tried to hand me this fake federal judge ID. When I told her it was fake, she got argumentative and tried to resist arrest. Judge Williams shook her head. That is not what happened at all. I was polite and cooperative throughout the entire stop. I provided my driver's license, registration, and judicial identification. When Officer Morrison refused to believe my ID was real, I asked him to verify it and he refused. Lopez could hear the ring of truth in Judge Williams' voice. She had interviewed enough people over the years to know when someone was lying. And Judge Williams did not sound like someone who was lying. Morrison, I really think we should call this in to the captain, Lopez said. Morrison's face turned even redder. I don't need to call the captain. I know how to do my job. This woman is a criminal and she's going in a cell. Morrison grabbed Judge Williams by the arm and started to lead her toward the holding cells, but Lopez stepped around the counter and blocked their path. Morrison, stop. I'm not comfortable with this. Let me at least run her name through the system. Morrison pushed past Lopez. Get out of my way. Lopez, you're interfering with my arrest. Lopez watched in shock as Morrison forced Judge Williams toward the holding area. She had never seen Morrison act this irrationally before. Yes, he had always been aggressive and had problems with racial bias, but this was beyond anything she had witnessed. The holding area had 3 small cells with metal bars and concrete benches. Morrison opened the first cell and pushed Judge Williams inside. The handcuffs were still on her wrists, cutting into her skin and making her arms ache. Morrison, you can't put her in a cell with handcuffs on, Lopez protested. Watch me, Morrison replied, slamming the cell door shut. Judge Williams sat down on the cold concrete bench and tried to process what was happening to her. She was a federal judge sitting in a jail cell because a racist police officer refused to believe who she was. The irony was not lost on her. She had sent many people to cells like this one, but always after they had received a due process and a fair trial. Lopez walked back to the booking desk and picked up the phone. She dialed the number for Captain Robert Martinez, who was at home but on call for emergencies. Captain, this is Lopez. I think we have a serious problem here. Morrison heard Lopez making the call and rushed back to the booking area. What are you doing? I'm calling the captain because I think you just arrested a real federal judge. Morrison tried to grab the phone from Lopez, but she turned away from him. "Captain, Morrison just brought in a woman who claims to be a federal judge. Her ID looks real to me, but Morrison insists it's fake. He won't let me verify her identity." Captain Martinez had been hoping for a quiet evening. He was watching television with his wife when his phone rang. Martinez had been dealing with Morrison's problems for years, and he had a sinking feeling that this call was going to be worse than usual. "Lopez, what exactly is happening there?" Lopez explained the situation while Morrison stood beside her, getting more agitated by the minute. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the phone. "Lopez, I want you to immediately verify this woman's identity. Call the federal courthouse if you have to. And do not let Morrison interfere with you." Morrison heard enough of the conversation to know that Captain Martinez was not supporting him. His anger and desperation were growing by the minute. "Captain Martinez doesn't understand the situation," Morrison said loudly. "This woman is a criminal and everyone is falling for her act." Lopez hung up the phone and turned to face Morrison. "The captain ordered me to verify her identity. Give me her ID card." Morrison clutched the ID card tighter. "No, I'm the arresting officer and these are my evidence." The situation was spiraling completely out of control. Morrison knew that if Lopez verified Judge Williams's identity, his career would be over. Worse than that, he would face serious criminal charges for falsely arresting a federal judge. His pride and prejudice had gotten him into a hole so deep that he could not see any way out. Lopez picked up the phone again, this time to call the federal courthouse. But Morrison grabbed the phone cord and yanked it out of the wall. "Morrison, what are you doing?" Lopez shouted. "I'm protecting this department from making a huge mistake," Morrison replied, but his voice was shaking now. Morrison looked around the booking area and realized that he was trapped. He had gone too far to back down, but he also knew that other people were starting to figure out that he had made a terrible mistake. In his panicked state, he made a decision that would make everything much worse. Morrison pulled out his service weapon and pointed it at Lopez. "Nobody is making any phone calls. Nobody is verifying anything. This woman is a criminal and she's staying in that cell until I can prove it." Lopez raised her hands and backed away from Morrison. She had worked with him for years, but she had never seen him like this. His eyes were wild and his hands were shaking. She realized that he was having some kind of breakdown. "Morrison, put the gun down. You're scaring me." Morrison kept the gun pointed at Lopez as he moved toward the door that led to the rest of the police station. He turned the lock and slid the deadbolt into place. "Morrison, what are you doing?" Lopez asked again. "I'm making sure nobody interferes with my arrest, until I can sort this out." Judge Williams heard the shouting from her cell and realized that the situation had just become much more dangerous. Morrison was no longer just a racist cop making a bad arrest. He was now an armed man who was holding both her and Sergeant Lopez hostage. The standoff had begun. At the Clifford Davis Federal Building in downtown Memphis, night security guard James Thompson was making his usual rounds when he noticed something unusual. Judge Williams' office light was still on, but her car was not in the parking garage. Thompson had worked security at the courthouse for 6 years, and he knew all the judge's routines. Judge Williams was always very punctual and never left her office without turning off the lights. Thompson walked up to the 3rd floor and knocked on Judge Williams's office door. When there was no answer, he used his master key to enter. The office was empty, but Judge Williams's briefcase was still sitting on her desk, and her computer was still logged in. Her coffee cup was half full and still warm. Thompson felt a chill run down his spine. In all his years working courthouse security, he had never seen a judge just disappear like this. He immediately called his supervisor, Deputy Marshal Robert Chen, who was at home having dinner with his family. "Deputy Chen, this is Thompson at the courthouse. I think we might have a problem with Judge Williams." Chen put down his fork and listened carefully as Thompson explained what he had found. Chen had been a U.S. Marshal for 12 years, and his primary job was protecting federal judges. The disappearance of a federal judge was the kind of emergency that made every marshal's blood run cold. "Thompson, I want you to lock down Judge Williams's office immediately. Don't let anyone in or out. I'm calling in the team." Chen hung up and immediately dialed the number for his partner, Deputy Marshal Sarah Kim. Kim was at the gym, but she answered her phone on the first ring. "Sarah, we have a potential emergency. Judge Williams is missing." Kim grabbed her gym bag and headed for the exit. "Missing how? What do you mean missing?" Chen explained what Thompson had found as he got dressed and prepared to leave his house. I'm heading to the courthouse now. Can you start checking her usual route home? Already on my way, Kim replied, jumping into her unmarked federal vehicle. At the same time, Judge Williams' husband, Dr. Michael Williams, was starting to worry at their home in the suburbs. Patricia was usually home by 10:30 p.m. when she worked late, and it was now almost 11 p.m. She always called if she was going to be delayed, but his phone had been silent all evening. Dr. Williams tried calling his wife's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. He tried calling her office, but there was no answer there either. After 30 minutes of trying to reach her, he decided to call courthouse security. This is Dr. Williams. I'm looking for my wife, Judge Patricia Williams. She should have left the courthouse over an hour ago, but she hasn't come home. Thompson was still at the courthouse, now working with Deputy Chen to try to figure out what had happened to Judge Williams. When Dr. Williams called, Thompson immediately patched him through to Deputy Chen. Dr. Williams, this is Deputy Marshal Chen. We're already investigating your wife's disappearance. When did you last speak with her? Around 6 p.m. She said she had some case files to review and would be home by 10:30 at the latest. This isn't like her at all. Deputy Chen asked Dr. Williams to stay by his phone and promised to call him as soon as they had any information. Then Chen called the U.S. Marshals Service Command Center in Washington, D.C. The command center was staffed 24 hours a day and coordinated the protection of federal judges across the country. When Deputy Chen explained the situation, the duty officer immediately escalated the case to the highest priority level. Chen, we're treating this as a potential kidnapping of a federal official. You have full authority to use whatever resources you need. Meanwhile, Deputy Marshal Kim was driving Judge Williams' usual route home from the courthouse. She knew the route well because the marshals had studied all the judges' travel patterns as part of their security planning. Kim drove slowly, looking for any sign of Judge Williams' car or any evidence of what might have happened to her. About 15 miles from the courthouse, Kim's radio crackled with an important message. All units, we have a GPS hit on Judge Williams' vehicle. The car is stationary on Highway 45, approximately 2 miles south of exit 23. Kim made a U-turn and headed toward the location. She arrived to find Judge Williams' black sedan parked on the side of the highway, with its hazard lights still blinking. The car was empty, but Kim could see that it had been stopped by police. There were tire tracks from a patrol car behind the sedan. Kim called Deputy Chen immediately. I found her car, but she's not here. It looks like she was pulled over by a police officer. Chen felt his stomach drop. A traffic stop should have been routine, but if Judge Williams was missing, something had gone very wrong. Kim, I want you to call the local police and find out which officer made that stop. I'm calling in the tactical team. Kim contacted the Memphis Police Department Dispatch Center and asked about any traffic stops that had occurred on Highway 45 that evening. The dispatcher checked the computer system and found the record. We show Officer Derek Morrison made a traffic stop at that location at approximately 9:50 p.m. The stop was logged as resulting in an arrest for impersonating a federal official. Kim felt her blood pressure spike. Did you say impersonating a federal official? Yes, ma'am. The suspect was transported to the precinct for booking. Kim immediately radioed Deputy Chen with this information. Chen was already in his car heading toward the federal courthouse, but he made a sharp turn toward the police precinct instead. Kim, meet me at the precinct and call Captain Martinez. I want to know exactly what happened during that traffic stop. At the police precinct, Captain Martinez was already dealing with his own crisis. He had been trying to call the station for over an hour, but all the phone lines seemed to be dead. He had tried calling Officer Morrison's radio, but there was no response. Finally, Martinez decided to drive to the station to see what was happening. When Martinez arrived at the precinct, he found something very strange. All the lights were on, but the building seemed unusually quiet. He tried the front door, but it was locked. He tried the back door, but it was also locked. Martinez used his key to enter through the side door and immediately sensed that something was wrong. The hallways were empty, but Martinez could hear voices coming from the booking area. As he got closer, he realized that one of the voices belonged to Morrison, and Morrison sounded very agitated. Martinez approached the booking area carefully and tried to open the door, but it was locked from the inside. He knocked on the door. "Morrison, it's Captain Martinez. Open this door right now." Inside the booking area, Morrison heard his captain's voice and felt his panic increase. He knew that Martinez would ask questions that he could not answer. He knew that his story about arresting a criminal would fall apart as soon as anyone actually investigated. "Captain, everything is under control in here. I just need a little more time to sort out this situation." Martinez did not like the sound of Morrison's voice. He sounded stressed and unstable. "Morrison, open this door immediately." That's a direct order. But Morrison was beyond following orders now. He was trapped in a situation of his own making, and he could see no way out that did not end with his career and life being destroyed. At that moment, Deputy Marshal Chen arrived at the police station with backup officers. When they found Captain Martinez trying to get into his own booking area, Chen knew that this situation was much worse than a simple case of mistaken identity. "Captain Martinez, I'm Deputy Marshal Chen. We believe you have a federal judge in custody." Martinez looked at Chen with shock and confusion. "A federal judge?" Morrison arrested someone for impersonating a federal judge. Chen and Martinez looked at each other and both realized the same thing at the same time. A racist police officer had arrested a real federal judge because he could not believe that a black woman could hold such a position. And now that same officer was barricaded inside the booking area, apparently holding both the judge and other officers hostage. The situation had just become a federal emergency. Deputy Marshal Sarah Kim arrived at the police station just as Captain Martinez was explaining the situation to Deputy Marshal Chen. More federal vehicles were pulling into the parking lot every few minutes as the U.S. Marshals Service mobilized their emergency response team. "Captain, how many people are inside that booking area with Morrison?" Chen asked. Martinez looked worried and tired. "Sergeant Lopez was working the booking desk tonight, so she's definitely in there. And if Morrison really did arrest a federal judge, then she would be in there too." Chen spoke into his radio. "Command, this is Chen. We have confirmed that a federal judge is being held against her will by a police officer who appears to be having some kind of breakdown. We need the full tactical response team here immediately." The command center in Washington, D.C. had already activated emergency protocols when Judge Williams was first reported missing. Now they were treating this as a hostage situation involving a federal judge, which was one of the most serious scenarios in law enforcement. Within 30 minutes, the parking lot of the small police station looked like a scene from a major action movie. Federal tactical teams arrived in black vehicles, followed by FBI negotiators, crime scene specialists, and high-ranking officials from both the U.S. Marshals Service and the FBI. Deputy Marshal Lisa Thompson, who was the lead tactical coordinator for the region, took charge of the scene. Thompson had 20 years of experience in law enforcement and had handled dozens of hostage situations, but never one involving a federal judge. "Chen, what do we know about the officer who's barricaded inside?" Thompson asked. Chen had been gathering information about Morrison from Captain Martinez and other officers at the station. "His name is Derek Morrison, 12 years on the force. Multiple complaints about racial bias and excessive force, but no serious disciplinary action. Captain Martinez says he's been getting worse over the past few months." Thompson studied the layout of the police station that Captain Martinez had drawn for her. The booking area was in the center of the building with only one entrance. There were no windows, which meant they could not see what was happening inside. "Do we have any communication with him?" Martinez shook his head. He pulled the phone lines out of the wall in the booking area. "We can't reach him by radio either." Thompson made a decision. "We need to establish communication before we do anything else. Chen, I want you to work with the police captain to find another way to talk to Morrison." Meanwhile, inside the booking area, the situation was getting more tense by the minute. Morrison was pacing back and forth, still holding his gun and muttering to himself about how everyone was trying to make him look bad. Sergeant Lopez was sitting at her desk, trying to stay calm and figure out how to defuse the situation. She had been a police officer long enough to know that Morrison was having some kind of mental breakdown, and people in that state were very dangerous. Judge Williams was still sitting in the holding cell, watching Morrison through the bars. She had been studying people's behavior for years as a judge, and she could see that Morrison was becoming more unstable with each passing minute. Officer Morrison, Judge Williams said in her calmest voice, I think we should talk about how to resolve the situation. Morrison stopped pacing and looked at her with angry eyes. There's nothing to resolve. You're a criminal, and everyone else is falling for your act. Judge Williams had been thinking about her strategy for the past hour. She knew that Morrison's prejudice was so strong that he could not accept the truth about who she was. But she also knew that he was smart enough to understand that his situation was getting worse with each passing minute. Officer Morrison, even if you don't believe who I am, you must realize that holding police officers at gunpoint is a serious crime. Sergeant Lopez has done nothing wrong and you're putting her in danger. Morrison looked at Lopez, who was watching him with frightened eyes. For a moment his expression softened and Judge Williams thought she might be getting through to him. Lopez doesn't understand, Morrison said, but his voice was less certain than before. She was going to make phone calls that would have ruined everything. Judge Williams pressed her advantage. Officer Morrison, what exactly do you think those phone calls would have revealed? Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Deep down he was starting to have doubts about his own story. The woman in the cell did speak like a judge. She did know a lot about the law, and her identification had looked very professional. But Morrison's pride would not let him admit that he might have been wrong. In his mind, admitting he was wrong would mean admitting that his entire worldview was wrong. It would mean accepting that black people could hold positions of power and respect. His prejudice was so deep that he would rather destroy his life than change his beliefs. Outside the booking area, Deputy Marshal Thompson's team had found a solution to the communication problem. The police station had an old intercom system that connected all the rooms in the building. One of the speakers was located in the booking area, and the control panel was in Captain Martinez's office. Morrison, this is Deputy Marshal Thompson with the U.S. Marshal Service. Can you hear me? Morrison jumped when he heard the voice coming from the speaker on the wall. He had been so focused on the people in the room with him that he had forgotten about the outside world. I can hear you, Morrison replied, speaking toward the speaker. Morrison, I want to talk to you about how we can resolve this situation peacefully. But first I need to know that everyone in there is safe. Morrison looked at Lopez and then at Judge Williams. Neither of them appeared to be injured, but Lopez looked scared, and Judge Williams looked tired and uncomfortable. Everyone is fine, Morrison said. Morrison, I'm going to be honest with you. We know that you have a federal judge in custody. We know that her identification is real, and we know that you made a mistake during the traffic stop. Morrison felt like he had been punched in the stomach. Hearing someone else say that Judge Williams was real made it impossible for him to keep denying the truth to himself. She can't be. Morrison's voice trailed off. Thompson continued in a calm, professional voice. Morrison, mistakes happen. What matters now is how we handle the situation from here. No one has been seriously hurt yet, and we can work together to make sure it stays that way. Morrison sat down heavily in a chair near the booking desk. The weight of what he had done was finally starting to hit him. He had arrested a federal judge because of his own prejudice. He had held police officers at gunpoint. His career was over and he was probably going to prison for a very long time. Morrison, are you still there? Thompson asked. Yeah, I'm here. Morrison, I want you to think about Sergeant Lopez. She's a good officer who was just trying to do her job tonight. She doesn't deserve to be in this situation. Morrison looked at Lopez again. She had always been fair to him, even when other officers avoided him because of his reputation. He realized that she was trapped in this situation because of his mistakes. Judge Williams decided it was time for her to speak up. Deputy Marshal Thompson, this is Judge Patricia Williams. I'm unharmed, but I'm still handcuffed in a holding cell. Hearing Judge Williams identify herself over the intercom was like a final confirmation for Morrison. There was no denying it anymore. He had arrested a real federal judge. Thompson's voice remained calm and professional. Judge Williams, we're going to get you out of there safely. Morrison, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You're in serious trouble, but how serious depends on what you do in the next few minutes. Morrison knew that Thompson was right. He had already committed several federal crimes, but if he released Judge Williams and Sergeant Lopez without anyone getting hurt, he might have a chance of avoiding the worst possible consequences. But Morrison's pride was still fighting against his common sense. Admitting he was wrong meant facing the truth about his own prejudices, and that was almost harder than facing the legal consequences of his actions. The next few minutes would determine whether this situation ended peacefully or became a tragedy that would make national headlines. Morrison sat in the chair by the booking desk, holding his gun loosely in his hands and staring at the floor. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in. Through the small window in the booking area door, he could see shadows moving in the hallway. He knew that federal agents were surrounding the building, and there was no way out. Deputy Marshal Thompson's voice came through the intercom again. "Morrison, I want to help you end this situation safely, but I need you to talk to me. What are you thinking right now?" Morrison looked up at the speaker on the wall. His voice was quiet and shaky when he finally answered. "I think I made a big mistake." Morrison, recognizing that you made a mistake is the first step toward fixing things. "Can you tell me what happened during the traffic stop?" Morrison glanced at Judge Williams, who was watching him carefully from her cell. For the first time since this all began, he really looked at her, not as a threat or a criminal, but as a person. He saw an intelligent, dignified woman who had done nothing wrong except drive a little too fast. "I pulled her over for speeding," Morrison said slowly. "When she showed me her ID, I didn't believe it was real." "Why didn't you believe it was real, Morrison?" Morrison was quiet for a long time. He knew the answer to that question, but saying it out loud would mean admitting something about himself that he had never wanted to face. Judge Williams decided to speak. "Officer Morrison, may I ask you something?" Morrison looked at her through the bars of the cell. "What?" "In your 12 years as a police officer, how many federal judges have you met?" Morrison thought about it. "I've never met a federal judge before tonight." "So you had no experience with what a federal judge's identification should look like?" "No, I guess not." Judge Williams' voice remained calm and professional, like she was questioning a witness in her courtroom. "Officer Morrison, what did you think a federal judge would look like?" Morrison felt uncomfortable with the question, but he found himself answering honestly. "I don't know. Different than you, I guess." "Different how?" Morrison's face grew red with embarrassment. "Different color." It was the first time Morrison had admitted, even to himself, that his actions had been based on racial prejudice. Judge Williams could see the shame in his eyes, and she felt a mix of anger and pity for this man who had put her through such an ordeal. "Officer Morrison, do you understand now why your assumptions were wrong?" Morrison nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think I do." Deputy Marshal Thompson had been listening to this conversation through the intercom, and she realized that Judge Williams was doing something remarkable. Instead of being angry or demanding revenge, she was trying to help Morrison understand his mistakes so that this situation could end peacefully. "Morrison, Judge Williams is showing you a lot of grace right now," Thompson said through the intercom. "She's trying to help you see a way forward. I think you should listen to her." Sergeant Lopez, who had been quiet throughout most of this ordeal, finally spoke up. "Morrison, I've worked with you for 5 years. I know you're not a bad person, but what you did tonight was wrong and you need to make it right." Morrison looked at Lopez with tears in his eyes. "Maria, I'm sorry. I never meant for you to get caught up in this." "I know you didn't, Derek, but you're scaring me with that gun."
"Can you please put it down?"
Morrison looked down at the weapon in his hands. He had been holding it for so long that he had almost forgotten it was there. But now he realized that pointing a gun at his fellow officers was one of the worst things he had ever done. "Morrison," Judge Williams said from her cell, "I want you to know that I don't hate you. I think you made terrible decisions tonight, but I believe you can still do the right thing." Morrison was crying now. The combination of shame, fear, and exhaustion had broken down all his defenses. "Judge Williams, I'm so sorry. I was wrong about everything. I accept your apology, Officer Morrison, but now you need to show that you mean it." Morrison stood up slowly and walked over to the booking desk. He set his gun down on the counter and pushed it away from him. Then he walked over to Judge Williams's cell and pulled out the keys. "Morrison, what are you doing?" Thompson asked through the intercom. "I'm letting Judge Williams out of this cell and I'm taking the handcuffs off her." Morrison unlocked the cell door and stepped inside. Judge Williams stood up and turned around so he could remove the handcuffs. When the metal cuffs clicked open, she rubbed her wrists where they had left red marks. "Thank you," Judge Williams said simply. Morrison stepped out of the cell and walked back to the booking desk. He picked up the intercom microphone that was connected to the speaker system. "Deputy Marshal Thompson, this is Officer Morrison. I'm surrendering. Judge Williams and Sergeant Lopez are both safe and unharmed. I'm going to unlock the door now. Thompson felt a wave of relief wash over her. Morrison, I want you to walk slowly to the door and unlock it. Then I want you to step back with your hands visible. Morrison did exactly as Thompson instructed. He unlocked the door and stepped back with his hands raised above his head. The door opened, and federal agents rushed into the room with their weapons drawn. Judge Williams and Sergeant Lopez were quickly escorted out of the booking area by paramedics who checked them for injuries. Both women were shaken but physically unharmed. Morrison was handcuffed and read his rights by Deputy Marshal Chen. As the agents led him toward the door, Morrison stopped and looked back at Judge Williams. Judge Williams, I hope someday you can forgive me. Judge Williams looked at Morrison for a long moment before responding. Officer Morrison, forgiveness is something that has to be earned. But I hope you use this experience to become a better person. Morrison nodded and allowed the agents to lead him away. As he walked through the police station hallway in handcuffs, he saw dozens of federal agents and police officers who had been working to resolve the crisis. He realized that his actions had put many people in danger and had created a massive law enforcement emergency. Outside the police station, news crews were already setting up their cameras. Word of the incident had leaked to the media, and this was going to be a major story. A white police officer had arrested and held hostage a black federal judge because he refused to believe she could hold such a position. Judge Williams was taken to a federal building where she could be debriefed by marshals and FBI agents. As she sat in a comfortable office, finally free from handcuffs and jail cells, she thought about what had happened to her. She had always known that racial prejudice existed in the criminal justice system. She had seen it in cases that came before her court, and she had worked to combat it through her decisions and advocacy. But tonight she had experienced it firsthand in the most personal and frightening way possible. Judge Williams also thought about Officer Morrison. She was angry about what he had done to her, but she also felt sorry for him. His prejudice had destroyed his life and career, and he would now face serious federal charges. She hoped that he would use his time in prison to think about his actions and change his beliefs. The immediate crisis was over, but Judge Williams knew that the real work was just beginning. This incident would raise important questions about police training, racial bias, and the protection of federal officials. She was determined to use her experience to make sure that something positive came out of this terrible night. The confrontation was over, but the consequences would last for years to come. 3 months after the incident, Officer Derek Morrison sat in a federal courthouse wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, the same courthouse where Judge Patricia Williams worked every day. Though she was not presiding over his case due to the obvious conflict of interest, Federal Judge Robert Martinez, who had been assigned to Morrison's case, looked down from the bench as the charges were read aloud. Derek Morrison, you were charged with kidnapping a federal official, civil rights violations under color of law, false imprisonment, assault with a deadly weapon, and obstruction of justice. Morrison's lawyer, a public defender named Jennifer Walsh, had tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the federal prosecutors were not interested in showing mercy. The case had become a national symbol of racial bias in law enforcement, and the Justice Department wanted to send a clear message. The evidence against Morrison was overwhelming. The traffic stop had been recorded by Judge Williams' car dashboard camera, which showed Morrison's hostile behavior from the very beginning. Security cameras at the police station had captured him pointing his gun at Sergeant Lopez. Most damaging of all, the recorded conversation through the intercom system had preserved Morrison's own admission that he had refused to believe Judge Williams was a federal judge because of her race. Morrison's trial lasted 2 weeks. Sergeant Lopez testified about Morrison's erratic behavior and his history of racial bias. Captain Martinez testified about Morrison's disciplinary problems and the complaints that had been filed against him over the years. Judge Williams herself took the stand and calmly described the entire ordeal from her perspective. Officer Morrison's actions that night were not just a mistake, Judge Williams testified. They were the result of deep-seated prejudice that prevented him from accepting that a black woman could hold a position of authority and respect. Morrison's defense lawyer tried to argue that her client had been having a mental breakdown and was not fully responsible for his actions. But the prosecution showed that Morrison had a long history of treating black citizens differently than white citizens, and that his behavior that night was consistent with his established pattern of bias. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges. Judge Martinez sentenced Morrison to 15 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 10 years. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Martinez said during sentencing, "your actions that night represented an attack on the rule of law itself. When you refused to recognize Judge Williams's authority based solely on her race, you violated the fundamental principle that justice is blind. Your sentence reflects the seriousness of these crimes and serves as a warning to others who might consider similar actions." Morrison's police career was over. His pension was forfeited and his family had been torn apart by the scandal. His wife had filed for divorce and his teenage children refused to speak to him. The prejudice that had driven his actions had cost him everything. The Memphis Police Department faced its own consequences. The FBI conducted a comprehensive investigation into the department's hiring, training, and disciplinary practices. They found evidence of systemic problems with racial bias that went far beyond Morrison's individual actions. Captain Martinez was forced to resign, not because he had done anything criminal, but because his failure to properly address Morrison's previous complaints had contributed to the crisis. The department was placed under federal oversight and required to implement new training programs focused on racial bias and constitutional rights. Sergeant Lopez, who had tried to do the right thing during the incident, was promoted to lieutenant and put in charge of the department's new Community Relations Division. She often spoke at police training seminars about the importance of standing up to colleagues who abuse their authority. Judge Williams returned to work a week after the incident, but the experience had changed her deeply. She had always been aware of racial inequality in the justice system, but experiencing it firsthand had given her a new perspective on the fear and helplessness that many defendants felt when they appeared in her courtroom. Judge Williams began speaking at law enforcement conferences and judicial training programs about her experience. She worked with civil rights organizations to develop new protocols for protecting federal officials from bias-motivated attacks. She also wrote articles for legal journals about the intersection of racial prejudice and police misconduct. 6 months after the incident, Judge Williams was invited to speak at the graduation ceremony for a new class of federal marshals. As she stood at the podium looking out at the young law enforcement officers, she thought about the message she wanted to convey. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Williams began, "you have chosen a profession that gives you enormous power over other people's lives. With that power comes an enormous responsibility to treat every person with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, gender, religion, or economic status." She paused and looked around the room. "I want to tell you about a night 3 months ago when a police officer's prejudice almost destroyed both of our lives." Judge Williams told the story of her encounter with Morrison, speaking honestly about her fear, her anger, and her ultimate decision to forgive. She talked about the importance of checking one's own biases and the danger of making assumptions about people based on their appearance. "The officer who arrested me that night thought he knew who I was based on the color of my skin," Judge Williams concluded. "He was wrong and his prejudice cost him everything. I hope that my experience can serve as a lesson for all of you as you begin your careers in law enforcement." The audience gave Judge Williams a standing ovation, but she knew that changing minds and hearts would take much more than one speech. The fight against racial bias in law enforcement would require constant vigilance and ongoing education. 1 year after the incident, Judge Williams received a letter from Morrison in prison. It was handwritten on plain paper and filled with apologies and expressions of regret. Morrison wrote that he had been attending racial sensitivity classes and working with a prison counselor to understand his prejudices. "Judge Williams," the letter read, "I know that nothing I can say will undo the harm I caused you that night, but I want you to know that I think about what I did every day, and I am working to become a better person. I hope that someday when I am released from prison, I can find a way to make amends for my actions." Judge Williams read the letter twice before deciding how to respond. She wrote back a brief note acknowledging Morrison's apology and encouraging him to continue his efforts at self-improvement. She did not forgive him completely, but she hoped that his experience might prevent other police officers from making similar mistakes. The incident had far-reaching effects beyond the individuals directly involved. It sparked national conversations about racial bias in law enforcement and led to changes in police training programs across the country. Several states passed new laws requiring officers to verify the identity of anyone claiming to be a government official before making an arrest. Judge Williams continued to serve on the federal bench with distinction, but she never forgot the lesson of that terrible night. She had learned that even in America, even in the 21st century, a black woman's authority could be questioned simply because of the color of her skin. But she had also learned that justice could prevail when good people stood up for what was right. Sergeant Lopez had risked her own safety to try to verify Judge Williams's identity. Deputy Marshal Thompson and her team had worked tirelessly to resolve the crisis peacefully. And even Morrison, in the end, had chosen to do the right thing and surrender. The incident had been a nightmare, but it had also been a reminder that the fight for equality and justice required constant vigilance from everyone who believed in the rule of law. Judge Williams was determined to continue that fight for the rest of her career, using her experience to make sure that what happened to her would never happen to anyone else. Years later, when Judge Williams looked back on that night, she felt proud of how she had handled herself under extreme pressure. She had maintained her dignity, shown grace under fire, and ultimately used her terrible experience to make positive changes in the world. Justice had been served, but more importantly, the cause of justice had been advanced. And that, Judge Williams knew, was what really mattered in the end.